I would like to welcome you here in Budapest for our first panel today with the title, The V4 New Economic Heart of Europe. Our panelists today, let me introduce them starting from that end. Géza Sebestyén, who is the head of economic policy department at Mathias Corvinus Collegium and associate professor at Corvinus University. Then following from the end of the table, Szabolcs Pásztor, who is the leading researcher at Oeconomus and associate professor at National University of Public Service. And here, György Kerekes, professional expert at Makronóm Institute. We have around 1 hour for this discussion, and I'll start with my questions, and then we'll have some time to open the floor for questions for the public. So my first question, the first round of the questions will be an easy start, and then we'll go for the hard things. So summarizing the results of the V4 cooperation, last year it was the 30 years anniversary of the cooperation, which was established in February 1991. Well, combined, the V4 group is the 5th largest economic group in Europe and the 12th largest in the world. What were the recipes of this kind of economic success, of economic growth in the last years? Let's start with Géza.
All right, very good question. So obviously, if you look at the weight of the V4 region, then the present weight differs from the weight in the past. There was a big fight, big achievements behind us, and the main reason why we are so strong right now is obviously because of the high growth of the region. So some countries were doing better in the region, some countries were doing worse, but the region in general was having a very, very good growth rate. So the average growth in the V4 region in the first decade of the 21st century was something like 2-3 percentage points higher than the average growth in the EU. So we were growing quicker, we were growing stronger, and that means that obviously we were progressing, we were actually coming nearer and nearer to the more developed countries. And still today, the growth rate is very good, around 1%, 1.5 percentage points higher than that in the more advanced economies. But that also means that we are still progressing, we are still coming closer to the more advanced countries. What was the recipe, or which were the main reasons? Basically, I would say two, and then maybe later we'll talk about some others or some of these two in depth as well. One was the very strong growth in employment. So if you look at the situation in 2010, then the employment levels in all of these countries, actually, maybe except the Czech Republic, but Hungary for sure, and Slovakia for sure, we had very, very low employment rates, the lowest ones in the European Union. Very few people were working in a nutshell. And that has increased a lot. Hungary was having the highest growth actually in the whole European Union. We have increased our employment levels by more than 15 percentage points, but also the other V4 countries were increasing the figures. So that means that right now much more people are working in this region than it was before. This is one thing. And the other thing is that, which is obviously coming, it is very, very strongly connected to the growth in the employment, is the growth in the wages. So the wages were increasing very, very rapidly. If you look at the last 8 years, in every year, every country in the V4 region was in the top, was having the top wage growth levels in the whole European Union, and it was much higher than the average levels in the European Union. So people are earning more. Obviously, this is also coming from the fact that 10 or 20 years ago, the wage levels in Hungary, in Slovakia were much lower than the European average. But the wages were increasing a lot, and that means that the consumption levels were increasing as well. And today, the growth in these countries, the GDP growth is partly driven by, or more driven by, domestic consumption than it was before.
Thank you so much. Well, when we open our economic history textbooks, it becomes clear that a couple of decades ago, Central and Eastern Europe, and let's mention the V4 countries, were the economic backweather of Western Europe. Trade connections and economic connections were quite limited between these countries. And I go so far and I say that in a number of countries, they said that when we cross the border, we reach the end of the world. But now we have to say that we have seen a visible improvement, and it is not an exaggeration to say that to a certain extent the V4 countries are the growth engines of the European Union. And previously you were asking about the recipes and the necessary ingredients. And during my university lectures, I usually highlight that FDI coming from the West in general played an important role in the transformation of the region. Until 1995, Hungary was the top recipient of FDI. Later, Poland took the lead. And when I want to season this story with a couple of interesting numbers, by the way, I have checked the latest data just before this panel. I would turn to the exports of goods and services as a percentage of the GDP numbers or data. In case of Hungary, this ratio is hovering around 80%. The Polish economy is a bit more closed economy. The ratio is hovering around 55%. Slovakia is an even more open country than Hungary, with an exports to GDP ratio around 85%. And we have to mention the Czech Republic as well. This ratio is 71%. So when we are trying to find the secret recipe, we definitely have to mention the influx of FDI. Apart from this, in the eyes of the multinational corporations, V4 workers are reliable, hardworking, highly educated, and as they usually say, it is easy to deal with them. Also, we have to highlight the relatively developed infrastructure as well. We have to highlight the fact that the governments, after the political changes, have created a business-friendly business environment, and they are really committed to better this business environment. And so we have to talk about a mixture of different ingredients when we say that when we try to find out why this region plays a more important role in the European Union economy and in the world economy. By now, the region is deeply embedded in the supply chain of the Western multinational companies. There are more suppliers coming from the region than before. If you don't mind, I'm going to mention one half funny story related to the importance of the suppliers in Hungary. In the 1990s, they started producing Suzuki cars in Hungary, and at that time, the factory had only one supplier, the mall, and the mall supplied 5 liters of petrol for every ready-made car. Since then, we have seen a steady increase of suppliers, and these countries have moved further in case of the value added in their exports. Among other things, we have to highlight these important points when we want to better understand the economic transformation and the success of these countries. Later, we may talk about the challenges as well, but now I will pass the floor for the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Szabolcs. György, could you carry on?
Thank you. I would like to join to Szabolcs of the importance of FDI and exports. In 2012, so 10 years ago, I had a chance to pay a visit to the UK Trade and Investment, which was at that time probably the best state-owned trade and investment promotion agency. And they had just launched then a project called Emerging Europe, and that was targeting our region. And that was the first time when I felt that we are really on the map. Then it started a flow even from the UK to Hungary in terms of FDI and companies. The other important thing is the competitiveness of this region, and not only the common sense of competitiveness, but there's an index called the Economic Complexity Index, first developed by some professors from the Harvard University, and these V4 countries are among the top on this index, which shows that how sophisticated goods and services are exported from the country in a how sophisticated way. So it means that how diverse is one country's economy and how diverse is the trade and investment portfolio of that country. And in the recent rankings, the Czech Republic is the 6th globally, Hungary is 10th, Slovakia is, I think, 14th, and Poland is just out of the top 20. So it means that these V4 countries are now not only some back garden of the Western European economies, but a deeply integrated part and a growing and emerging part, as the English said. And I think besides those factors that the other gentlemen mentioned, the logistics is a key. Logistics in a physical way. So there are the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure we have where to connect the Western European economies, and also the immaterial logistics, which means the network of businesses, the supply chains, and all the other factors that contributed to the outstanding growth in the last 10 years.
Thank you very much. Before we go on to the next topic, I would like to make an advertisement. We have a book published by Danube Institute on the Visegrad Group last 30 years, which you can take once the panel is over at the stand when you go for your coffee. So let's move on. And I know you prepared some graphs. If you want to present anything connected to my first question, just let me know.
I think the FDI flows and stocks would be nice to see. At first, it would show those data Szabolcs mentioned about what percent of the GDP is the actual export of these countries, which is a good index to measure the openness of the economy. And also it would show the stock of FDI, so all the foreign direct investment that is accumulated in the region. It also shows, that's an option. And FDI flows. These are the flows. So that shows that all of the V4 countries are doing well in terms of FDI. So every year, with some waves, we see new investors coming to these countries, and there's no real crisis that can stop this flow. No stop at the 2008, and even the COVID showed that the FDI flow is still going on. And if we move one further, so this is the FDI stock, which shows that the Czech Republic has the highest figure, followed by Slovakia and Hungary. And Poland is on the 4th place, but it still shows that in the last 20 years, this region accumulated more FDI than probably other developing region in the world. And that's probably the most important.
Do you also have something to? Yeah, if you could switch from Géza.
Until we see it. Okay, great. Yes. So here what we can see is the share of the V4 countries regarding the total GDP created in the European Union. As you can see that in 1995, okay, we were not part of the European Union, but still this indicator makes sense. In 1995, this figure was below 8%. And right now, it's above 11. So it has increased a lot. That also shows that we are, in fact, one of the economic powerhouses in the European Union. But what is more interesting, if you compare this figure, so the economy of the V4 is having 11% weight in the European Union. But if you compare the added value, so the GDP growth, where is the GDP growth coming from? From which countries the GDP growth of the EU is coming from? Then this region is generating in the last 4 years, and every year, almost every year, we generate 16, 17% of the total growth. So we are, our weight is 11%, but we generate 16, 17% growth within the region. These are very good numbers. Obviously, I agree with my colleagues with all the positive things, but if you would like to help the future as well, and if you would like to keep up these good figures, then I have two advices. For all the countries, actually, not just for Hungary, for all the countries in the V4. If you look at some other figures like the R&D spending, then we can see that it has increased significantly in the last years in all of these countries, but it is still low. So if you would like to, as Szabolcs has mentioned, a big part of the success was that we were able to shift from very low level production to higher levels of economic production. But if you would like to continue on this path, then we have to increase the spending on R&D. And the other where we can improve as well is the researchers per employee. Here, Hungary was making a very big step recently, as you can see on the chart. But we are still lagging behind the significant players in the European Union. And also, on the other hand, European Union is not the champion of research in the world. Okay, and even in Europe, we are not the best. So if you would like to continue with the good growth, then we have to spend more on R&D and we have to invest in researchers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. My slides can come later, so you don't have to prepare them. Well, I have a couple of points in front of me. First of all, I want to tell everyone why we are obsessed with the size of the V4 countries. If we open macroeconomic textbooks and international economics textbook, we will find a gravity model. The gravity model says that when two blocks, regional economic blocks, for example, are relatively close to each other, they will trade a lot more. And when these two blocks are sizable, they may trade even more. So when the size of the V4 countries increases, we may expect even more cross-border trade and international trade. And well, according to the obvious research output of millions, I say, trade is good for everyone, and we can benefit from international trade. So there is an obvious reason why we continuously talk about the size of the V4 region. The other point, what I want to highlight is indeed a crucial one. In economics, there has been an evergreen debate whether copying is innovation or not. The most important phases of the history of economic thought approach this question from very different angles. And it is indeed true that when we adopt new technologies, we may reach a certain level of development, but after a point, we need our own researchers, we need our own fine minds as well. And it is indeed a question how the remarkable economic growth could be sustained. And in case of the V4 countries, we keep mentioning the so-called and the famous or the infamous middle income trap. And we have to, or we may dedicate an entire conference into this or to this issue escaping or being capable of escaping the middle income trap or not. So, well, we have to say that the economic growth has been remarkable. During the COVID years, the V4 countries remained resilient. They turned to pretty much the same fiscal and monetary measures. And it is indeed a question whether the remarkable economic growth rates could be sustained in the future. And we have to talk about those measures to be taken to provide this visible and sustainable economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go on for the next topic, which will be, basically the challenges which we experienced or which are ahead of us. Let's start with the first part of this, the challenge of COVID-19, the global pandemic, which we are facing since 2020. How are the V4 group, how did they overcome this challenge? What were the different strategies of anti-COVID measures, and how did they work in economic relation? Maybe let's start with György.
Okay. If we only talk about economics, then we can say that this was probably the third big crisis in the last 20 years. First, 1998, when the Russian-induced economic crisis was, then the 2008 crisis, and then the COVID crisis. And we can say that economically, the V4 countries become more and more resistant to these kind of economic shocks. And we can see that all of these economies not only survived, but were able to recover quite shortly after the first shocks of COVID. The strategy of the V4 countries were a little bit different. We can say that Hungary chose to increase the investment of the companies, or at least have a stable growth in investments. We can see the investment ratio in the presentation if we can. Hungary has the highest in the last 2 years among the V4 countries. The other three countries tried to get ideas from all over the world with short work schemes and some money given to companies and individuals. And it seems that it works somehow. So with the help of the growing exports and the imports, these economies survived in a good shape. But we will see that the trade balance in all the V4 countries were changed to negative from the positive trend in 2021, not in 2020. The last 12 months showed in all of the V4 countries that maintaining a high investment ratio caused an increase in imports. And that's one factor of why the trade balance is now negative in every country.
Thank you very much. Szabolcs?
Yeah, thank you. When we talk about the economic dependence and the economic independence between the United States and the European Union, we tend to say that when the US squeezes, Europe gets cold. We may apply this wisdom to the European Union and the V4 countries as well. So when Western Europe or when Germany squeezes, the V4 countries may get cold. And with this, I just want to season the dependence and the interdependence between Western Europe and the V4 countries. And during the pandemic, it became clear that when certain large economies faced problems, the V4 countries faced problems also. if I'm not mistaken, I don't have to remind you that in Hungary especially, there is an over-reliance on the Western economies. The government announced the famous Southern opening and Eastern opening programs and policies. They were fundamentally right in doing so because among the trading partners of Hungary, for example, we will find Germany, Austria, and there is a visible and obvious over-reliance on these countries. So when there is a recession or an economic decline, in case of our trading partners, we have a certain room for maneuver, but this room for maneuver is not large enough, I have to say. So when the COVID started, there was a visible economic decline in Hungary, and everyone was talking about the real impact, and everyone was talking about the number of jobs lost. But it became quite clear in Hungary and in the region as well that the V4 economies proved to be resilient. So after a sharp decline, when they turned to opening or reopening, the economy went back on the previous track or the previous tracks, and we experienced quite remarkable economic growth. We have to confess that the labor market helped this process. Many lost their jobs in the first months of the COVID crisis. And later, when they turned to the opening of the economies, many of them found new workplaces. We may turn to the personal experiences as well, and we may turn to statistical data which show much light on the growing size of certain employment sectors and certain other employment sectors. It was quite remarkable that the governments turned to the same recipe. Everywhere they try to stimulate the economies, and they try to make use of the room for maneuver in the budgets. Well, they turn to cutting taxes. They turn to subsidizing the small and medium-sized enterprises, for example. They try to retain the disposable income of the households as well. Well, it was quite clear that they were dedicated to mitigate the impact of the economic decline. And at the same time, especially in Hungary, they try to, the government and the economic policy makers try to breathe a new life into the investment sector, as we mentioned before. And hand on heart, we have to confess that they faced multiple headaches because they had to mitigate the impact of the economic crisis, and at the same time, they had to increase the value added in exports. They had to place the country on a path built on sustainable economic development and continuous transformation of the most competitive sectors. So, well, we have to be cautious, and there is an old saying, wait till the end before making a judgment. But so far, we have to say that the Central and Eastern European countries managed to avoid the double-digit economic declines. And right after experiencing a drop in the economic activity, the countries in the region managed to breathe a new life into their economies. And when we turn to a couple of macroeconomic indicators, we cannot complain. In a number of cases, our macroeconomic indicators are a bit better than before the crisis, before the COVID crisis. Let me mention one. For many years, we were complaining about our employment ratio. And when we turn to the latest statistics of the OECD, it turns out that currently the employment ratio in Hungary is much better than the OECD average. And we are far from the weakest performing Greece, for example, where the employment ratio is only 57%. In Hungary, the employment ratio is over 70%. And when we compare 2019 and 2022, we may point to a slight increase as well. Thank you.
So, Anton, you were asking about the secret recipe. What was the recipe of the success? And every good cook knows that for a recipe, it's also important what you should include, but also it's very important what you should exclude, what you shouldn't use for this dish. And I totally agree with my esteemed colleagues about what they have mentioned, but I would like to mention some other elements which were used by the countries, and it is good that we were not using them. Okay, one of those elements, and I don't know if we will be able to use the PPT, my PPT, but one of those elements was the helicopter money used mainly by the US. Okay, so it is not very well known, but the US was quadrupling the amount of money in circulation when the COVID was hitting the US. So it is unprecedented. It never happened before. It was thank you. It was a very, very huge increase, and what researchers are showing us is that this is about the interest rates. They were cutting the interest rates as well, so they were stimulating. They were doing very, very strong monetary stimulation with lower interest rates and printing a lot of money. And what history has taught us that when there is a big boom or a big increase in the money supply in the US, then after 1.5 years, inflation comes. And what do we see right now? Inflation. And you could say that, okay, but the US was doing that. Okay, so in the US there should be inflation. Why do we have inflation elsewhere? For somebody who is selling fruits in Africa or selling oil in the Middle East, they don't care who is the buyer. Okay, they will sell for anybody. And if somebody is paying higher price, they will sell for them. If there's a bigger demand somewhere, and the US is a big country, then that demand will drive up the prices for everybody. Okay, so obviously we have other reasons for the high inflation, but this is one very, very important reason which is often missed. And I think it's very, very good that we were not doing this, we were not following this path, because obviously in Hungary everybody is talking about the inflation right now as well, but the inflation in Hungary is mainly coming from abroad. And I think, and my hypothesis is that it's coming mainly from the US because of the money printing in the US. So if we would have done the same, obviously the inflation levels would be much, much, much higher. So that was a good thing that we were not doing that. Another thing that, and also if you look at the other effects of the helicopter money, okay, just imagine that if you lose your job, because there were two different ideologies. Okay, in Hungary, for example, the ideology was that if somebody loses the job or on the verge of losing the job, then the government will help the company to be able to keep that employee. The most important thing is maybe that employee is not really working right now, maybe staying home, maybe not really adding to the GDP, but we help you to keep that employee because later you will be able to use him or her. Just imagine the other solution that was used mainly in the US and the UK, that we give a lot of money to everybody and you don't have to have a job. You will have the money, you can buy stuff, it's fine for you. This generates inflation on one hand, and what is the other effect? Obviously you lose your job and then you have to search for employment, which is not easy if you were not working for months. And then obviously the unemployment levels will be high for a sustained amount of time. And this is what you can see here. So this is the employment level of 3 countries. I was very patriotic here. I was only including Hungary, sorry. But I was trying to keep the number of countries at the minimum level. So you can see the US, you can see the UK, and you can see Hungary. And in the US and the UK, helicopter money. In the US, huge drop. in employment levels, and it has increased after that, but we are still below the pre-crisis levels. Amazing. So still less people are working in the US than before the COVID crisis. In the UK, it's also not a good evolution. It was not having a big drop, but it is actually constantly decreasing. So still, they also have a lower level of employment right now than before the crisis. In Hungary, very, very early after the crisis, we had higher levels of employment. So, and I think it is the most important thing because you can do anything. But if people are losing their jobs permanently, that is a very, very big problem for families. And in Hungary, it was not happening. So I think that this way that we were leaving out some ingredients which were used by other countries, and actually, if somebody was living in Hungary and know what was happening at that time, the opposition was actually opting for this solution. Okay, there was a very, very strong demand for giving people free money, and it was not. I mean, obviously, we have to wait to see the whole picture. I agree with Szabolcs, but I think that these charts are very, very striking. And for somebody who is not having jobs since 2 years, maybe on the very long run, things will change. On the very long run, we will die. Actually, that's also true. But maybe the situation will be better on the long run. But right now, it's not good. And that is, I think, that's a very, very significant difference how we were handling crisis and how other countries were handling it.
You want to react something?
Only an anecdote or a joke. During the introduction, John mentioned Ronald Reagan. And when I was listening to you, Géza, something came to my mind. Ronald Reagan said that the best social program is a job. So giving people jobs and workplaces is much more important than direct government intervention in most of the cases. So it seems that in the United States, they have forgotten about the Reaganomics and the words of Ronald Reagan. But here, there is much here in Hungary, there is much focus on creating workplaces and maintaining workplaces. Well, sorry, this was just a so short comment.
Thank you. So next challenge, the war in Ukraine. Well, before the war, we thought that COVID-19 is our biggest problem. But it appeared it wasn't. Well, 3 countries out of 4 from the Visegrad Group are neighboring Ukraine. And now we are facing a whole bunch of problems, starting with food shortages, problems with energy supplies. Well, it's today's news that Russia just stopped supplying Bulgaria and Poland with gas. Logistic problems, high inflation, problems with trade relations, and so on. Are we, as Central Europe, are we prepared to handle such problems which are coming? How will we face all these problems?
And I would like to use the slides one more time. Sorry for that. But yeah, there are a lot of difficulties, and you have mentioned inflation as well, Anton. And right now we have 2 black swans, 2 very, very rare events at the same time, which are both having the same negative impact, negative for us on inflation. One is the COVID. And what history has taught us, if there is a global pandemic, then the first effect is usually, or actually always, that inflation levels are dropping. Because people are not buying stuff. They are trying to save money, they are unsure what the future will bring, so they are not consuming, so prices are going down. But later, when the situation is solved, or better, then inflation is picking up, and usually it is higher than before. Okay, so we have a boost in inflation. The other black swan is the war, obviously. We were not having war. I mean, I'm 50 years old. In my life, we were not having a war. We had war in Yugoslavia, but that was a little bit different. So the wars are having the opposite effect on the inflation. The first effect is a boost in inflation. First, there are shortages. The countries not producing goods, also countries not buying stuff from other countries. So we have shortages, and that because of that, the prices are increasing. And we have the 2 effects at the same time. So right now, we have inflation, and then the U.S. money printing, the third one. But these are the 2 big phenomena which were happening, unfortunately, synchronized in a way that they're both having the same increasing boosting effect on inflation at the same time. And if you look at the region, and if you look at the region in broader terms, and these are the inflation figures in February of this year, then you can see that the top 8 countries are, I've included Russia as well. So Russia is one of them, but except Russia, the 3 Baltic states and the V4. So these countries are having the highest levels of inflation. The V4 countries are marked with red. So it seems that we are in a very bad situation, very bad place. But if we go into details, then the situation changes a little bit. Okay, it's not very different, but it changes a little bit. What you can see here is the change in inflation in 1 year. Okay, so how much has the inflation increased in a year? And we have to keep in mind that so we have started with the GDP growth, with the very strong GDP growth of the region. And we have to obviously know that if a country or region has a high GDP growth, that country or region will have high inflation rates as well. So GDP growth and inflation, they go hand in hand. So obviously, the Hungarian inflation, the Polish inflation, the Czech inflation should be higher than the inflation in the European Union, obviously, because our growth rate is bigger. So that is one thing. So it's not surprised that we have higher inflation figures than some other countries because we have higher growth. So that is the consequence of a good thing at the end of the day. But how is inflation increasing? It's a very important thing because it shows the dynamics, and which is really scary in some countries and not so scary in some of the V4 countries. Okay, so in 1 year, the change, if you look at the picture, it is crazy. In Lithuania, Estonia, the inflation has increased by more than 10 percentage points in a year. They had almost 0.6. Estonia was having negative inflation figures 1 year ago. And right now they have 10% or higher inflation figures. It is crazy, unprecedented. It's really unbelievable. And adding to this, okay, who is fighting against the inflation in these countries, in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia? The European Central Bank. How is the European Central Bank fighting against inflation? Usually you have to increase interest rates. Where is the interest rate in the European Central Bank's interest rate? 0%. Is it fighting? No, not at all. So this is a very good example why the common money, in some cases, in some situations, like right now, is not beneficial for some countries. Okay, if the economic cycles are not synchronized, which is the case here, and you have higher inflations, but inflation is low in Italy, inflation comparably low in Italy, comparably low in France, the European Central Bank is waiting. We will see. They hope that it will work out. It might work out in Italy. It might work out in France, but it will never work out within these inflation rates. In the Baltic states, it will never work out in Slovakia, which has euro as well. Okay, so it's a very bad news for these countries. Hungary is doing the best in this chart. If you look at the V4 countries, okay, so we are in the middle of the chart, so it has increased as well in Hungary too. Obviously, we cannot avoid it, but we have much better figures. And how we are handling it? The last slide from me regarding this topic. How we are handling it? So once again, European Union. This is the change in the interest rate during 1 year. What has happened? This is not fresh because the Hungarian Central Bank was working against me. They have raised the interest rates yesterday. I was not able to include that step in this chart. But the European Central Bank is doing nothing to fight inflation. Which are the countries which are doing something to fight inflation? Russia is doing, obviously, a lot of things, or we're doing a lot of things to fight inflation, but not just inflation. Obviously, they have other problems as well. And the 3 other countries which are fighting right now inflation in the whole Europe are those 3 V4 countries which are having their own monetary policy. Okay, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. So we are fighting against inflation. We are increasing the interest rate. The central bank is increasing interest rate and trying to push down the inflation figures. Obviously, in Hungary, other things are happening as well. Maybe my colleagues will talk about that. But actually, inflation is a big problem. I totally agree with you. But we are doing our best, at least this region. And this is exceptional. That I mean, we have the V4. We are very similar in growth. We are very similar in the economic successes. And we are also very similar if we look at fighting inflation.
It's 5.4 now, right? The new inflation rate.
5.4 exactly, 5.4, and it is something like If you look at the start, they started the cycle at 0.6. Yeah, so it's almost 5 percentage points higher right now than it was at the time.
And why Slovakia is so low?
Slovakia, they have euro.
Okay.
They have euro, and the European Central Bank is doing nothing to stop their inflation.
Okay.
Because European Central Bank is not, they're not focusing on the problems of Slovakia. They're not focusing on the problems of Estonia. They're not focusing on the problems of Latvia. They have huge problems and nobody is helping them. This is very, very, I think in Hungary, there's a big talk about if we should have euro, we shouldn't have euro. So what are the pros and cons of the euro? This is a very, very big con, in my opinion, that if your business cycles are not going with the business cycles of the most important countries by most important, I mean from the perspective of the European Central Bank, okay? Which countries the European Central Bank is looking at when they are making their decisions. If your business cycles are not moving together with these countries, then you can have this situation that you have high inflation. They don't have high inflation, so the European Central Bank is doing nothing and nobody's fighting your inflation. You don't have the monetary authority in your country anymore, so.
Szabolcs?
Thank you so much. So basically you were asking about the economic challenges and the challenges related to the ongoing war. Well, I was debating in my mind what to highlight, and among other things, I'm going to mention the supply chain issues and the rising prices and energy prices also. Well, supply chain issues. Even if you want to buy an Italian furniture, it may turn out that the spring comes from Ukraine or Russia. So when we talk about the supply chains, we have to point to the fact that the supply chains are complex. And it is quite meaningless to talk about Italian cars any longer, or German cars or Italian furniture. And well, when certain suppliers disappear, I say, Russian and Ukrainian suppliers, we have to wait more, and of course we have to pay more. So I expect further supply chain disruptions, and the ordinary customers have to pay more for this or for that. We have to mention the rising food prices as well. I was browsing the business news early in the morning, and well, now we have a warning related to the incredible food prices in the coming years, so we have to prepare for the best. Many items will be much more expensive than before. I think everyone knows the reason. There is much agricultural potential in Ukraine and in Russia as well. And there are the other consequences related to the Middle East and related to East Africa as well. I think I don't have to mention these issues. The V4 countries like Germany are heavily dependent on Russian energy. These countries are heavily dependent on Russian gas shipments. There may be disruptions with these shipments, and according to the worst scenarios, the households have to pay or will have to pay much more than before. It may represent a decline in the purchasing power of the households, and it may represent a decline in the disposable income of the families. So, unfortunately, there are challenges ahead. And even if the war finishes tomorrow, we have to prepare for these challenges. If you ask me, I expect a change in the consumption pattern of many families and of many individuals in the foreseeable future. The multinational corporations are busy because they want to find other suppliers, and somehow they try to maintain their production processes. They are trying to find ways of getting rid of the increasing input prices, if they can. There are a couple of other things what we could highlight, but I say that in the foreseeable future, we have to deal with rising prices, shortage of this, shortage of that. And let me conclude or finish my comments with what the Japanese say. In the minds of many Japanese, those are the most intelligent, who are the most flexible, and who can adjust to the rapidly changing circumstances. So to a certain extent, we have to follow the Japanese example, and we also have to be flexible if we can. I am referring to our consumption pattern, for example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a perfect final word for me, because you don't have to be that clever to, like Admiral Akbar, to see that it's a trap here. So we are trapped, like with the inflation, rising energy costs, and the rising prices of all the import stuff we have. But if I would be a mouse, what I would do in a trap is to at first eat the cheese to get some energy, and then try to fight out of this trap. And to understand how to fight out, we should probably see how other countries suffer from the current situation globally. I lived in Singapore and Malaysia before the COVID came for 3 years, and with some friends, we founded the Central and Eastern European Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, all together with V4 and other countries' companies. Because the main reason was that there was the Euro Chamber with all the Western companies, and nobody was dealing with the V4 companies. But the main point is that just this week, we received an invitation from the government of Singapore to have a presentation on what food items we could export to Singapore, because they also see the problem and they want to diversify their import sources. In many other countries globally, we could have the chance to see what they are thinking about their imports. So what we have is, like, first is that most of the V4 countries, especially Poland and Hungary, has quite a formidable food industry now, with some quite good companies and perfect items. So we should find new markets, because prices are high, so we can gain from it. Also, we mentioned already R&D, the importance of R&D. So we should find those markets where we could sell not only goods, but services. Of course, services have less import portion, so we only need people who can provide services, like in IT. Therefore, what the V4 countries and the V4 governments should do is to help their companies, SMEs and larger companies, to be able to find new markets. And of course, because I'm an export promotion expert, this is the way how I could fight myself or these countries out of this trap. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we started 10 minutes behind the schedule, so we have still a few minutes. I have many questions, but let's open the floor for public questions. And yes, if you could, we collect some questions and then we give the floor to our experts. Please introduce yourself and ask the question. So yes, please, gentlemen.
Hi, thanks. How do human capital flows, particularly of the expert classes and multinational workers coming from places like the UK, North America, and Western Europe into the V4, which is something that we've seen accelerate in recent years, how does that affect the growth prospects, and how much is that expected to continue?
Thank you. Maybe one or two more questions and before answering.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm György Kerekes. I would like to ask if any of you has any data on where does the FDI coming from, majoritarily from which countries to Hungary and to other V4 countries. Thank you.
One more question. Yes, the gentleman there.
David Kerekes, Central Europe Trust. There is some reference made to the middle income trap earlier today. The discussion has been mainly about macro. Would be interested in your views on the micro side, the development of locally owned businesses that are adding greater value to enable moving up on the income ladder, and also the financing of that. Poland has perhaps been the outlier in terms of tremendous per capita GDP growth, much of which was financed through the Warsaw Stock Exchange, which is by far the largest in the region. And interested in your views on financing, capital allocation, particularly in the market, in the smaller V4 countries that have smaller stock exchanges? Thanks.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions. Who would like to start?
I'll start. So the answers are yes, no, yes. I mean, okay. So to be honest, for first question, obviously it has a good impact. I don't know the figures. So I have to be honest with you, I don't know the figures. But I really see the same. I have a lot of friends coming from countries which, when I was a young kid, we considered as a good destination to work there, and actually it has totally changed. And I was working for the at Corvinus University. I was working for the department of the National Bank, and in my room there was a guy coming from Holland. There was another guy coming from Spain, and the girl who came from the UK, from European Central Bank, actually. Sorry, the British, the Bank of England. Thank you, exactly. So it is really happy. They were all Hungarians, but they came from countries. They were living there for years, for long years, and they were all coming from countries which are more advanced than Hungary is, and actually more advanced. If you look at the GDP, other stuff, I think that the living standard in Hungary, and especially if you have, you work in a work environment where there is the variance is high, then you have very good chances in Hungary, and that is partly because, as you might know, the tax rate in Hungary is a flat rate. And if you have a comparably higher wage, then obviously working abroad, their taxes are higher for you comparably. So we can see it, that more and more people who are having really good skills and education, they come back to Hungarians as well, and they come back or they come to Hungary. So this is really happening, and I think it's a very, very good thing for Hungary. So obviously for the GDP as well, but I think it's more important for transfer of knowledge, because they worked abroad or they born abroad. They know how business is done there. They know the theories there. They know the how the economy is working there, and they bring that knowledge to Hungary or the region, and it's a good thing for us. I'm really happy for that. Obviously, we have to mention our host as well. So this is also one way how you can help us, how you can help the region. Regarding the next question, I'm sorry, I was not really even writing it down because I'm not an expert in that area, so I will leave it to my colleagues. But regarding the SMEs and the financing, I had the opportunity to talk this weekend, with 2 companies. I mean, the Hungarian exchange has a lot of programs for smaller companies which are planning to join the stock exchange, and they educate them, they help them, they print or they make online materials to give them some support. And I was talking to 2 heads of 2 different companies, which are all SMEs, and they're all middle-sized companies or bigger middle-sized companies in Hungary, family-owned companies. And I asked them, is this because they were talking about the problems they have. Obviously, one of the problems which companies are facing right now, that I was talking about wage growth, that the wages in Hungary and also in the other V4 countries were increasing a lot. This is a good thing for employees, but obviously this is a bad thing for companies from a cost perspective. And they talked about a lot of things, and also they were talking about the shortage of funds, shortage of financing. And I was asking them whether going public is an option for them to issue shares on the exchange. And they said that this is a good learning experience for them. They really enjoy it. They have learned a lot, and they see how it is done. But it's not really an option for them because it's not cost effective for their size. So they have to. There are a lot of costs which are substantial for a company of that size. So I think that maybe the difference between Poland and Hungary, that the size of the economy is obviously correlates with the size of the average company as well. So obviously for an average Polish company going on the exchange, obviously the costs are probably similar, as I know, but for a bigger company, those costs are relatively smaller. So I think that Poland has a big advantage, which is very hard to to emulate in Hungary. That you are big, Poland is bigger, so it's very, very hard to compete with that one. So I think that the part of the success of Poland is coming from there, and it's hard to replicate here.
Thank you. If you would like to comment that, please do it in short.
Shortly.
Yes.
Okay, so the largest FDI exporters to Hungary. If you see the countries, you can say that in the last 3 years, Germany, Korea, Japan, the US and China were the largest exporters. If you see the number of incoming companies, then Germany and the US are on top, because the large Korean and Chinese investments are usually linked to 1 or 2 companies. That's the short answer. For the SME financing, I think this is now the point where a group of companies are able to export capital. I mean, they need to stabilize their market presence through venturing into their established export markets, and through acquisitions, they can have a stable presence. And therefore, the governments or exchange, whatever, so they need some capital export programs to be able to grow on these markets.
Thank you, Szabolcs. If you want to add something.
If you don't mind, I have only one comment related to the middle income trap and capital allocation and SME financing. And look, my approach will be quite unique, and I approach this question from an unusual angle. I have to say that Central and Eastern Europeans are obsessed with flats and property. And the home ownership ratio is quite high in these countries. In Romania, it is almost 98%. In Hungary, it is over 92%. It may be good, but at the same time, it may be bad. When, families have income, they usually buy a flat or a second one or a third one. And even companies abandon their core economic activities and they switch to building flats, they switch to building property. And well, the problem with this is that capital is missing for research and development. And unfortunately, when the families and when, for example, the companies keep their savings and their capital in properties, they don't have sources and resources for research and development. And well, half jokingly, when I'm teaching my students, I usually tell them that, as a big investor, we may choose between 2 options, buying property and letting them out to university students, or financing and developing softwares, financing and developing the bettering of certain projects. You may have your own answers, and you may have your own answer related to what is the best for an economy, for getting rid of the middle income track, for example. So I usually approach this question from a quite unusual angle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this note, I would like to close this panel, and I would like to thank our experts for your assessment. So.